like Lothar, but he does associate with him with a state of rebellion and unlawful government, which show that for Nithard, rebellion and illegitimacy were really important concepts that he associated with tyranny. I also thought that the difference between the way he characterizes Lothar and Pippin could be that he made a distinction between an unlawful ruler, which would be Pippin, and a tyrannical ruler, which would be, or a bad ruler, which would be Lothar, and a tyrannical ruler, which would be Pippin. So my third chapter is all about the rhetoric of tyranny. So I found that the author, Rhetoric of Tyranny in the Annals of Fulda. So I found that the analyst used accusations of tyranny to delegitimize political opponents through constructing a dichotomy of a good ruler and a tyrant. This construction would primarily be done by presenting a current ruler or a past ruler, like Charlemagne, as a representation of an ideal king, and a tyrant as a complete perversion of those kingly roles that I discussed in my first chapter. Secondly, accusations of tyranny were used to justify the actions of those who went against the tyrant. So a ruler who needed to act against a political opponent in a way that might make him look like a tyrant, he would accuse his opponent of tyranny, which would give him the justification he needed to act in that, way that would seem evil and tyrannical. He's like, oh, I'm just doing this to respond to that tyrant over there. And so the significance of my thesis is that, to my knowledge, there has been no scholarship that discusses tyranny in the Annals of Fulda and the histories of Nithard in detail. And therefore, in my thesis, I present a new analysis on the discourse of tyranny in the Annals of Fulda and Nithard's histories. Furthermore, my attempt to answer why Nithard never called Lothar a tyrant has never been considered before, to my knowledge. Furthermore, my analysis of the Annals of Fulda goes even further than understanding how the annalist conceived of tyranny, as I discuss how he used tyranny rhetorically in the text. My discussion of the rhetoric of tyranny also contributes to the current scholarship because it shows that accusations of tyranny could be used to delegitimate political opponents or justify actions taken against a tyrant. My study is significant because understanding how Pinsmar, Nithard, and the analysts described tyranny, how they used it rhetorically, can show us much about their political philosophies. And that is my thesis. Anyone have questions? Yes?
Yeah, so I'm guessing you were a European history concentration, right?
Yes.
Awesome, okay. So I guess, so the first chapter was like the idealism of a good king,
yes,
verse, and then chapter 2, so you had 2 chapters in total.
3. The first one is kingship, second one is tyranny, and then the third one is like the rhetoric of tyranny.
Oh, that's what
Yeah,
it's
sorry, I should have made that distinction, yeah.
Yeah, so the third chapter is like a smaller chapter.
Yeah, it's where I kind of combine the two and talk about how how authors would kind of put a tyrant and a king up against each other, and then that comparison would be used to delegitimize a political opponent. So like they would show that ruler would be unfit. So by showing like, oh, this person over here is an ideal king, it really emphasizes how unfit to rule the tyrant was, or their political opponent who they accused of tyranny was. So it showed like that they were negligent, that they were illegitimate, that they couldn't rule, and so that was used, as a rhetorical tool.
Gotcha, okay. So so at the time, and I'm familiar with Charlemagne, he was one of the, he was the Holy Roman Emperor, when he was pushing back he was also responsible for pushing back the Moorish invasion in North Africa. Well, not in North Africa,
But yeah.
Battle of Tours.
Yes.
But yeah, so with Charlemagne, you know, he had the divine right to rule because of that. And it was when he was pushing back the Moors back to Spain, and like you were discussing how the divine right to rule. So would you argue that was a contributing factor to legitimacy, or did it not make it? Went against like the bad, did the bad king have? Like, did not have the right to rule? Like, that's my point. Like, that's my
Did the
point.
bad king not have, the
divine right to rule.
divine right to rule? It kind of differs. So one of my authors, Hinsmar, he said that a tyrant existed, and even though they were evil and stuff, God still permitted them to rule for the specific purpose of punishing their subjects. And so he also stated that they still had sovereignty, and they still had the right to rule, and then God permitted them to exist, but he didn't exactly in the text he wouldn't be like, oh, God endorsed these actions for a tyrant. So if you were on the other opposing side, you wouldn't be like, oh, God endorsed the actions of this tyrant. But if you were the tyrant yourself, you would be like, yes, God endorsed me to do this. So it's kind of like flip sides. Like usually the person that one of the people calls a tyrant, that person calls the other person a tyrant. So they're just like accusing each other back and forth and stuff. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I like how you use like the language of tyrant versus what was the antonym of tyrant you said?
Like good kingship.
Good kingship. Okay, so yeah, this tyrant, I feel like, you know, when I was studying, I took a couple of European history course. I was history. Yeah. So like, I don't know, it's like that's like Robespierre. You know, when you think about all these people, like they always use the same language of tyrant, and it's been a consistent theme. Right? Like this was what, the 12th century CE, right?
It's the 9th, but like I mean, the Middle Ages, like a lot of things are similar and stuff. So okay.
Yeah, but you see like all the way to like the 1700s, early 1800s, you know, the reign of terror and all that stuff. So like you use the language tyrants, like it's just so relevant, you know, with European history.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but amazing job.
Thank you so much. You did great too.
Great.
Thanks. I have a question.
In your research, did you find that the definition of tyrant came more based upon what someone did, or based upon the allegation that they were an illegitimate leader because of how they became?
It differs. So, for my example with Nithard,
Right.
he bases his accusation of tyranny based on like how Pippin became a ruler.
Correct, as opposed to Lothar, who was a right ruler but acted poorly.
Yeah.
Is he an outlier, or is that consistent with others?
So there are a lot of like rulers who did act badly, who weren't accused of tyranny. But I explained that in something I didn't talk about is that the Carolingian royal family. There's a work from a person named Stuart R. Lee who talks about like the specialness of the family, how they would like portray themselves as really grandiose and amazing, and people would be hesitant to call a member of the royal family a tyrant, especially if they were part of the core, like if they were the king or the king's sons. But sometimes, a lot of times, they would call more marginal members, so like grandsons and kind of like nephews. But I found that it does vary. So like, that a lot of the times, like, but like with in the Annals of Fulda, Charles, for the most part, came about his rule legitimately, but he acted poorly, and so the annalist calls him a tyrant, but he was trying to poke holes at Charles the Bald's, he believed that he was like the emperor. He was according to this emperor, and the analyst who supported Louis was like, the German was like, no, you like was trying to
Was
delegitimize
he trying
that.
to say he was like his father?
Yeah, like so so Charles was trying to put himself in the same vein as Charlemagne, because they both had their coronations on the same day, like obviously like years apart, but so he was purposely
All
trying
in the
to.
same calendar.
Yes. yeah, it was, it kind of differs, like there wasn't, like for some it was about how they obtained power, for others it was kind of more about their morality.
Do you find any correlation between the accusations that were made against leaders as tyrants or illegitimate back in the 9th century with what we say in today's political discourse?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I mean, I know that's not part of your
Obviously,
thesis,
like,
but-
you don't really be like, people are pillaging and
Right.
burning churches, but I mean, you see, like, a lot of the people that we call tyrants now, like, are morally corrupt people, and we usually associate tyranny with that moral corruptness, and like how, you know, like if they're invading, or if they're putting people to death, and but that is more, nowadays a lot of tyranny comes from like more like absolute power and conceptions of authoritarianism, that a lot of that wasn't really seen in, I could be wrong, but in what I've seen is a lot of that, those ideas and like conceptions of the state, like for example with Russia with Stalin, the state wasn't really a thing like the way that we think about a state now.
Okay.
So it wasn't, so there are some similarities in terms of like morality, but we more are talking about like with tyrants now are like despots, or people who
Well, the word's used a lot. I
Yeah.
mean, the one side, I mean, in the United States,
Mhm.
no matter who's the leader, the other side calls them a tyrant.
yeah,
And I just find that fascinating that, you know, history's repeating itself.
oh yeah,
And they try to delegitimize how they became the leader. Well, he's an illegitimate, you know, it was stolen, you know, all that stuff. And this has actually been happening for centuries.
Mhm.
And history repeats itself, which is what your colleague mentioned in his presentation, of history repeating itself and our inability to now learn from it.
yeah.
Good job.
In a nutshell, Charlemagne, and I would just quote it, but apparently he was the ideal, but didn't he have some major flaws as well?
Yes, he was a very, like, and some of the capitulars, he like murdered lots of people, lots of the whole, like the people called like the Saxons, he like demolished them and like forced them into baptisms. So he actually like wasn't, and I, like, in my opinion, was not a very good person, but in the Carolingian times, he was kind of considered like the great, like Nithard calls him Charles, deservedly called the great, and Nithard actually calls him great because he subdued the Saxons. So like I'm talking more like kind of how they thought he was the ideal during that time period, but obviously like he wasn't, and he was very problematic. But yeah.